the chat, and we'll do our best to answer. And if there's anything else I can do, let me know. Thank you, Kat and Saiya.
Hi, thank you, Nick. Thank you also everyone for joining us today for this presentation on safety planning for survivors in the sex trades. I'm going to get started with this PowerPoint presentation. Sorry, of course there are already technical difficulties, but I think I clicked it, and I will be back momentarily.
Hey, Kat, can I, this is Alex Gerald again. I just want to let folks know, in case people entered a little bit later, that we are live streaming this event on the Department of County Human Services Facebook page. And if you would not like to appear on that live stream, you can go ahead and turn your video off. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. I just had a little bit of a challenge getting the presentation was further back. So restart, y'all. Thank you so much. I will be sharing my screen now so we can get the presentation started. Thanks for your patience. Awesome. Thank you all so much for bearing with us. We now present our presentation today, Supporting Survivors at the Intersection of Sexual Assault and the Sex Trades, presented by Saiya White and Kat Salas.
So we can start by kind of talking a little bit about what we do and how we got started. So we kind of founded the resource project in March of last year after the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a increased need for community support before PUA, which has its own set of complications. There were no resources for workers who had lost income due to loss of work. So we kind of started out of that and have kind of adapted as a resource project over last year. And we have continued to support sex workers in many different various ways. We started with doing microgrants to highly impacted communities. Amazing. We did a microgrant for parents. We did a microgrant for immigrants. We did a microgrant for wildfire relief. And then we also did a microgrant for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So those are kind of like the microgrants that we did last year. This year we have kind of taken more of a public health approach. We still intend to do direct financial support. And we are now doing some harm reduction based public health work in sex worker communities.
To date, we've distributed over $45,000 in 2020 and served hundreds of individuals. I think it's an important price point to touch on, because we often think of, you know, two folks and a small group of community like only being capable of distributing like a small amount of funds, but in reality, the Mutual Aid Project was really successful and we're able to distribute quite a significant amount of money internally through both grants as well as mutual aid, which was incredible. Before we get too much into supporting folks in the sex trades at the intersection of sexual assault, it is important to give some context around what the facets of the sex trades are. I recognize that there's a lot of different expertise in this room and also probably a bit of a learning curve. And so hopefully this sets a framework up for the rest of the presentation. This graph is a great way of sort of showing that the sex trades in general exist on a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum being exploitation, and the other side of the spectrum being total autonomy. We often get caught up in language when we talk about the sex trades, specifically in sex work, concerning an idea of validity and empowerment. And so it's really important to kind of like take a step back and look at language that centers not necessarily empowerment, but autonomy and choice. You can also see that underneath this spectrum, there's an arrow that says self-determination. And the importance of that is recognizing that we as service providers are not the ones who get to tell someone how they're feeling on this scale. Throughout the spectrum, you can see that there's a ton of gray area, right? And it is important that we listen to, support, and trust survivors, as well as trust folks in the sex trade to let us know where they feel that their experience falls throughout this sort of intermeshing and spectrum of gray area between exploitation and autonomy. The reality is that some types of work can feel autonomous for one person, but based on intersections be exploitative to another. And it's also common for an individual in the sex trades to fluctuate throughout the spectrum during their time in the sex trades. Someone can have part of their career feeling very exploitative and other parts of their career feeling very autonomous, and both can be valid, and we as service providers should and can hold both at the same time. When we talk about self-determination, I like to use this little Venn diagram because, of course, there are so many outside factors that influence an individual in the sex trades outside of just sort of like it's exploitative or it's autonomous. Well, an individual has total ownership and over where their experience falls on that spectrum, it's also important to recognize that it exists in a larger sphere. And the larger sphere, kind of interpreted in this Venn diagram, you see the overlapping instances of circumstance, coercion, and choice. And in the middle, again, we see self-determination and folks' ability to be the experts on their own experience and tell us where they're at. I think it's also great to sort of see this Venn diagram because there isn't necessarily like all of these things that exist totally separate from one another, right? We see that there's intersections of circumstance and choice and they influence each other, circumstance and coercion and they influence each other, and choice and coercion and they influence each other. When we talk about the sex trades, it's also important to talk about all of the different forms of trading sex. Sex trades does not equal sex work, and sex trades does not equal sex trafficking. We're talking about forms of trading sex: stripping, full service, street-based, online advertisement, pornography, phone sex operation, erotic and nude massage, sugar baby relationships, and so many others. Any and all of these forms of trading sex can fall in any and all places along the spectrum of exploitation and autonomy, as well as throughout the Venn diagram of circumstance, choice, and coercion. And of course, we can't look at every single experience of all of these outstanding factors existing in a vacuum. The root causes of specifically sex trafficking are in the context of the oppressive structures that are operating at multiple levels. We have to remember that the sphere that we talk about with trading sex and the sphere that we talk about in which exploitation and autonomy of folks trading sex works, or sex work, or sex trafficking and survival sex, also exist in this bigger environment of patriarchy, racism, capitalism, environmental terrorism, settler colonialism, and. I like to go through a quick example of how things exist on the macro, meso, and micro levels, specifically using the example of racism and white supremacy. So on the macro level, everyone in this room, I hope, can acknowledge that Black and brown bodies have been exploited through the culture of white supremacy, settler colonialism, and racism for as long as America has existed. Even go so far as to name that that's what America was largely built on. However, these ideas are often internalized in the ways that we have organizational structures, which in the terms of trading sex might look like discrimination, might look like less opportunity, might look like policing and heavily policed Black and brown communities, might look like violence in Black and brown communities from white supremacist organizations. And then looking at micro, and again, acknowledging that this is incredibly oversimplified, but micro meaning that an individual who is in a community that has been marginalized, that has less resources, that has discrimination in the workforce, that has limited opportunities, might be at higher risk for being exploited because there aren't as many options on the table. And basically what I'm trying to say is all of these factors affect anything at every level. And I think we all know that, but it's also good for an example. And then the last thing before getting into screening survivors that we like to touch on is that within this sort of circumstance, coercion, and choice Venn diagram, there are also sort of three major ways that we categorize the experiences of trading sex. And the reason that I don't put it on the diagram is because I feel like it gives it kind of too much of this very specific, this is where this is on the diagram, this is where this is on the diagram. And as much as I love kind of a graphic, and my brain definitely works that way, I also want to be cautious of the way that we oversimplify and overgeneralize things, as it is sort of the nature of large presentations. And so kind of speaking around three of the words that you're going to hear throughout this presentation and important distinctions to know is the distinctions of sex work, survival sex, and sex trafficking. And if we had to sort of put these on the scale, we would definitely put sex trafficking in the far end of exploitation. And for the sake of this conversation, consensual adult sex work on the part of autonomy. And then, of course, we have sort of survival sex happening all in here. Again, this is an oversimplification. And again, there are folks who are doing sex work that do not always feel like it's autonomous. And there are folks who are being sex trafficked, but might identify it in a way that's different. But when we think about sort of the ways that we categorize the facets of the sex trades in the experiences of folks doing that work, language that you'll hear us use is sex trafficking, survival sex, and sex work.
All right, I'm going to talk about screening, and something that we have heard a lot of times in doing the work and interacting with people in our communities is that they have tried to access these services and are often screened out, which means that, you know, they have maybe called the crisis line or tried to engage in services, and we're basically either not asked the right questions or something else came up to where they weren't entered into services, even though they were technically eligible for services. So I am going to talk a little bit about how we can screen sex workers without even them needing to tell you that they might be sex workers. Because a lot of times that is something that people don't really want to share. And sometimes, you know, people might not describe their experiences in a way that like jives with the questions that we're asking everyone else. So, you know, and it's it's a shift in mindset, but it's also a lot about language. So let's see. So there is a lot of overlap between like sex work, domestic violence, and sexual assault. And that can kind of look like, you know, maybe someone is assaulted while they are working. And because of stigma and because of like the mindset that a lot of people hold about this type of work, they might not describe their experience as assault. So for instance, asking someone, were you sexually assaulted? They might say no, even though their experience, though they're describing it in a different way, their experience in itself makes them eligible for services. So, Kat, do you want to read this scenario?
Yes, thank you. So we're going to start off with sort of structuring, and you'll see this structured throughout the presentation, of really kind of using hypotheticals and practice scenarios in order to gauge not only the information that is held within the audience of this presentation, but also to workshop things that are probably going to come up, or might feel like things that have come up before, or might feel like things that we're familiar with, to sort of like get in the mode of how to screen folks. So number one, this is our first practice scenario. After the practice scenario, please drop your sort of like any type of answers to the question in the chat. All right, practice scenario. Kim is a Black cis woman who identifies as a sex worker. She says that she was assaulted on a date with a full service client. Oh, and actually, you know, before I start this, I'm so sorry. I do want to be transparent that some of these scenarios do have triggering information, not necessarily graphic information, but do discuss sexual assault. This is a presentation on sex trafficking or sex trades and sexual assault. And so if this is something that you feel uncomfortable with or that you feel triggered by, please feel free to do whatever you need to take care of yourself, step away from the screen. For full transparency, it's something that is going to continue to come up throughout the presentation. Awesome. So sorry for not saying that sooner. Starting over. Kim is a Black cis woman who identifies as a sex worker. She says that she was assaulted on a date with a full service client. She is 27 years old and lives with her boyfriend. She's afraid to tell her boyfriend because he thinks she only works in a strip club and doesn't know that she does full service. Since this happened, she hasn't been interested in consensual sex with her boyfriend. He doesn't understand why she isn't interested and at times has pressured her to have sex when she doesn't want to. How would you interact with this person as an advocate? Please drop some answers in the chat.
And this isn't a trick question and there's no like right or wrong. But, you know, just kind of how would you interact with this person? What follow-up questions might you ask? That kind of thing is like what we're looking for. Letting them know it's a confidential conversation. Asking what her needs are, letting her lead the discussion. Maybe she wants to talk about her boyfriend, or maybe she wants to focus on the assault. Open-ended questions. Giving information about options for getting medical care if she wants that. Letting her lead. Asking what her needs are. Offering a confidential advocate she may have a racial affinity with. A lot of asking her what she needs, for sure. Support, normalizing, destigmatizing language, validation. Yeah, so those are all really great answers. We're gonna go to the next slide, and we have kind of bolded like some parts of the scenario that would maybe be things that would stick out that might inform what questions you ask or what steps you take. So she is a Black cis woman, so definitely like if there's, you know, someone that she can identify with, that would be a great place to connect. And she's telling us that she identifies as a sex worker, so we're not gonna, you know, say anything like, are you being trafficked? Are you trying to get out of the industry? Because that's letting us know that she identifies as a sex worker, and that is, you know, the way that she identifies. Assaulted on a date with a full service client. So we're saying that she is using that language. So we would mirror her language and, you know, respond with how she's describing this. So she's saying it's an assault, so we can refer to it as an assault. She's 27 years old. That is an important part. It's a very important piece of information. I think a lot of times when, like, since New Day has started, I was working on the crisis line at Call to Safety when the New Day program was born. And I think that, you know, it's kind of tricky. Sometimes folks don't know what to do when, you know, someone has basically aged out of a program they would otherwise be eligible for. So, you know, that is where we come in as advocates and offer creative safety planning to try to piece together support to meet their needs. Afraid to tell her boyfriend because he thinks she only works in a strip club. You know, that's complicated, right? Because, you know, that's kind of like her decision to keep that information to herself, regardless of whether, you know, we think that she should tell her boyfriend, you know, that doesn't matter. And, you know, and then there's this added layer of, you know, he is now pressuring her. So again, in the comments, someone said, ask her what she wants to talk about and what her needs are. And I think that that's great. You know, maybe she's more affected by the situation with her boyfriend than the situation with her client, or vice versa.
Ooh, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so kind of like what I was talking about earlier, like a shift in mindset. Kat put together these 5 advocate agreements for screening individuals trading sex. Acknowledging the inherent power dynamic between advocate and survivor. You know, you might think that you're the coolest advocate in the world, but to someone, you might just be a service provider. And, you know, being okay with that is really important. We want to kind of like acknowledge that power dynamic and try to like approach people knowing that that exists. And also like acknowledging that and being like, I know that this power dynamic is happening between us. Is there anything, you know, that I can do to make you feel more comfortable with me? To distrust in the system is valid and understandable. Like I said, kind of a little bit ago, it really is feels awful to referring someone to a resource and for them to say, I tried that and I got screened out, or I tried that and they said that that resource wasn't available. So it's understandable that people would have distrust. And for that reason, I will talk more about this later, but, you know, kind of having the mentality of under promise and over deliver, which also includes like not making big promises, like we can get you housing, and instead saying like, we can try to make this happen, and giving people all the information by saying, this is a really difficult thing to do, but we can try. Or this can take a really long time, but we can try. And accepting that we might never know the full story. I think that as advocates, sometimes we want to understand, and that kind of leads us to wanting explanations and wanting to know the full story. It also leads us to make assumptions, because when we don't have all of the information, sometimes our brain likes to fill in the gaps, and that's how assumptions get made. So I think it's really important to like hold each piece and to not try to fill in the gaps or complete the story, because it's not our story, it's another person's story. And acknowledging that assault and sex trade might be identified differently. You know, that could be someone who performs work and doesn't get paid. That could be a variety of different scenarios that are, you know, kind of unique to being in the sex trades. And understanding that trading sex is considered a crime, no matter how destigmatized it is for some forms of sex work. So for example, you know, we are kind of like at a time where online work is like very normalized and destigmatized, but full service work is very much so still very stigmatized and very illegal. So, you know, we also want to acknowledge that even if we are confidential advocates, I think that there's still a fear of institutions, and like being a part of an institution is kind of like part of this culture that is like adjacent with law enforcement. And so I think that that's important to acknowledge and recognize as well.
If we're going to be talking about, you know, what trading sex and what sexual assault looks like through the sex trades, it's also important to understand that it exists in kind of an environment and an intersection always of capitalism. We cannot talk about survival sex, sex work, or sex trafficking without an understanding of how capitalism affects all of these things. Reward and risk have different meanings for everyone. So dependent on your circumstance, dependent on the identities and intersectional identities or marginalizations that you might hold, and depending on your resources, you are going to identify what a reward is and what a risk is uniquely. When the reward is a resource needed to stay alive or safe, the risk may feel equal because of that circumstance. And when we talk about safety planning, this is going to be really, really important to keep in mind, as well as narratives around supporting someone who maybe has been sexually assaulted multiple times and identified that to you in their line of work, but is not expressing wanting to leave the industry, or is not expressing wanting to leave someone who is trafficking them. There are intersectional factors that inherent risk. For example, Black trans women will be risking more in any given situation than cis white women. So kind of thinking about this graph, the inherent risk for a Black cis woman doing, or a Black trans woman doing work is always going to be higher from the get than someone else. And Black trans women are compensated less on average than cis white women and cis white workers. Folks may not have other options to meet their resource needs. And so we're kind of thinking of, like, as providers, if we're supporting someone and staying safe, how can we look at the resources that influence the risks that they're taking in trading sex and help them meet those identified needs with the resources that are accessible, and that we can support them in getting screened into successfully. So kind of thinking of an example of risk, let's say that someone is working in a high-end strip club, they have steady income, they have their basic needs met. If someone in that strip club walks in and says, you know, I'll give you $100 to go home with me, and they're a complete stranger, for a person in that circumstance, the risk is extremely high and the reward is maybe less than they could make in a night anyway. So it's significantly different than someone who is offered that same amount of money, $100 to go home with a stranger, but they're needing to meet a need surrounding being evicted from their motel where they live with their child. Because the reward, which I think a better, yes, but also the resource is higher, the stakes are higher for them, they're more likely to take that risk. And as service providers, it's important to think about the intersection of resource and the resources we have access to in institutions in order to connect folks with the resources where they can meet those needs and hopefully be able to assess their risk in a different way. The reality is that trading sex has one of the highest lethality rates of any profession. And so when we are able to offer options, we are able to support folks in their own autonomous ability to say no when something doesn't feel like it's worth it to them.
Cool. So we put together some questions that sometimes we use to screen people. And, you know, questions are a great way to gain information. And that's what we need as advocates when we are on the line with someone or working with someone, maybe for, you know, regardless of whether we are on the phone with them for 10 minutes or we have been working closely with them as their direct service advocate for a month or up to a year. Asking questions is, you know, how we receive information that is necessary for us to do our work. Where that can be tricky is sometimes in our delivery or language of the question that can give a participant or someone that we are working with information about how much they can trust us. So if we're asking someone, have you ever been sexually assaulted? That might feel very abrasive. That might feel very invasive. And the person might not even describe their experience in that way. So as someone mentioned earlier with the other scenario, we can kind of turn this into a more open-ended question. And then in the end, we ultimately get more information. So instead of saying, have you ever been sexually assaulted? We might say, has anyone ever pressured you to do things that you didn't want to do? And in trying to identify people as sex workers, we do this as well. We try to form an identity instead of an experience. And I think that we can get a lot more information and build trust by asking people more about their experiences than trying to apply an identity. The slide is really long. And all of these kind of like trauma-informed screening questions Kat formatted into a very cool and stylish poster that should have been sent out to everyone. So if you would like to reference these at any point later, that exists and should have been sent out to participants. And again, kind of like going back to for the bottom part of the slide, under promising and over delivering. I think that a lot of times as advocates, we really want these things to happen for people, but it can be really re-traumatizing when things are promised, but not delivered. I think especially in the sex industry, that happens a lot with clients, where we are sometimes overpromised something, like whether it's housing or a car or $100, and then sometimes that those things that are promised are revoked, and so that can be very re-traumatizing to experience, especially in the setting of an institution. So instead of saying, we can get you into housing, we'll get you out of the industry, we'll pay your rent, we can be realistic and transparent with them by saying, this thing is really hard to do. It sometimes takes a lot of time to get folks into housing. We can start the process and I can walk you through the process, but I just want you to know that it takes a lot of time. Cool. So with that in mind, we can move into a scenario. So Claire is a 19-year-old white trans woman. She was trying to access services because she was physically assaulted by someone she had met that night. After de-escalating, she discloses that the perpetrator was a man she had met and offered her money to come back to his hotel. She declines a police report and Saba advocate. She is frustrated because this man owes her money, and the only reason she agreed to this date was because she was short on rent and needs to pay off a debt to someone. She doesn't disclose who she owes money to, but is evasive when you ask. How would you support this person?
And again, we can.
I think we'll do the in the comments.
Awesome. And we might also add, like, what questions might you ask this person as a follow-up?
Okay, so focusing on the rent, because that's an immediate need and not so much the debt owed to this individual. Yeah, asking what the most urgent needs are. So helping someone kind of like prioritize and move through how to make next steps.
Another thing we could ask Saiya is what services do you identify this person being eligible for, and like why? Or what the indicators were that this person would be eligible or would be successful and should be screened into a service.
Right. Yeah, so someone said in the chat, she's already identified wanting to access services. So asking her what services, and she's already using that language, totally. Ask her if she is okay and find out what she needs. Asking if she feels safe. See what services she can access. Not pressing on asking who the individual was, but ask follow-up questions around if the person she owes money to is making her feel unsafe. Validate feelings, see what's needed, making sure she's safe. Validation, validating that she's feeling frustrated, as well as her decision to avoid the police and Saba. Asking if she could let us know a little bit more about the living situation and whether she's aware of any services or resources that can help. All right, so next slide, we are going to go over some things that stick out. So she's 19 years old, which means that she is within the new day range. So that might be something that she is interested in. And a lot of times when we ask people what services they need, they don't know what's available. So sometimes we can, with something like all of the information that she's giving us, we know that she is a new day age range. So instead of making that connection, we can ask, New Day is a program that supports youth in the sex trades. Is that a resource that you would be interested in? Because maybe she doesn't identify as trading sex, and therefore might not want to access a service where that is the demographic that is being served. So next, something that sticks out is, has offered her money to come back to his hotel. So we know that within our lens, she's trading sex. So she is technically eligible for services for people who trade sex, even if she does not identify that way. So it's okay if she wants to decline services for that reason. But for our purposes of screening and requirements, that requirement is met. And yeah, the only reason she agreed to this date was because she was short on rent and needs to pay off a debt to someone. And is evasive when you ask. So yeah, a few people said in the chat not to press that because we don't know. It might be her uncle who she borrowed $200 from and, doesn't want to talk about it. Again, this is a situation in which, our brain might fill in the gaps, or we might kind of like create scenarios that maybe aren't even happening based on the limited information that we have. So yeah, definitely focusing on the imminent need, which is the housing piece. So maybe, yeah, focusing on how to meet the need instead of kind of jumping, as it were.
Thank you. Awesome responses, y'all. Practice scenario 2. A person calls and says they need help. They met a date online, and when they went to his home, he tried to pressure them into things they had not agreed upon. They were very scared and went outside to smoke, but called to see if they could get a motel. They have nowhere else to stay tonight, but they decline to share their name or age. They keep asking for help, but will not give any other information about themselves and state they do not have an ID. How do you support the survivor? What questions might you ask? And based on what they're telling you, what things might they meet the criteria for? And again, if you want to just drop the answers in the chat. Are there any, I can't see the chat. Are there any responses coming up?
Sorry, I didn't realize you couldn't see the chat.
No, it's good. My screen, it shares like everything.
This one feels especially tough because most motels require ID. Tell them and tell them that it's hard because most hotels require an ID. But offer as much help as you can. Ask to see if they want a cab to go to a friend or somewhere they feel safe. Could be an option if those funds are available. Ask if they feel open to a shelter. Ask them if they're safe and do some safety planning to get them to a public area. Woo. Ask them if they have a safe place to go. Offering options. Seeing what's available. asking if they've been in this situation before, or if they've solved this problem before and what has worked.
So sort of like the last time, here's a couple things that might stand out. Those are a lot of really great answers. They met a date online. So we know that there's like, that might be a little bit of a red flag, but again, important to not be necessarily filling in blanks or making generalizations about things that we don't know. And kind of coming back to what Saiya had said earlier about recognizing we might not know the entire story. It could be Tinder, it could be Bumble. And at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily really matter unless they identify that they want to share more about it. He tried to pressure them to things they had not agreed upon. Again, like recognizing we don't have all of the information, but this might be a good indicator to ask follow-up questions around trauma-informed follow-up questions around what these things might be. And share with them that you might say like there are services for, specifically knowing that there are services for sexual assault survivors. You might ask questions around if, these things were sexual, in order to sort of screen them into those services and being able to offer them those services without directly asking, did he sexually assault you? Are you being sex trafficked, etc. Saying they declined to share their name or age, which is really challenging. Thinking about under promising and over delivering. So being really transparent about the motel voucher, being really transparent about the funds that are available, and that it would be difficult. If the agency is confidential, you might also remind them that like it's confidential, and that if, hypothetically they were to be a minor, that's something that would stay between y'all. If you're not confidential, this might be something that raises a bit more of a red flag and could be an opportunity to connect them with a confidential advocate, like doing something like calling call to safety or seeing if you could get support through a confidential advocate within your organization. They keep asking for help, but they will not give any other information about themselves. I think this is important because, we want as providers to use tools like motivational interviewing to get as much information as possible. But if a conversation is happening and someone is continuing to share like that they are in a state of urgency and that they have a need, sometimes the best that we can do is recognize that it is their choice if they want to share more information about themselves. And while that may limit the services that they're eligible for, it's important to center the needs that they're identifying. And if right now they're saying that they need a place to stay tonight, navigating that conversation with trauma-informed care.
And just one more thing about that scenario. A lot of folks mentioned asking if they were safe. And the reality is they might not be safe, but it still might be the best option for them. So, at the end of this, we as advocates, we want to problem solve and we want to get people out of unsafe situations. And also at the same time, based on all the information that they're willing to give us, we might not have a solution. And that is a sucky thing about being an advocate, is that we can't always fix everything. But, in this situation, this may be the reality and it may be the best option and also unsafe.
Which kind of leads us into our next slide portion of the programming, which is safety planning for survivors in the sex trade. And Saiya, I really appreciate you bringing that up because I think it's kind of like a great road to the reality that oftentimes what is the best option is not always a safe option. It might just be a less dangerous option. And so safety planning and being able to safety plan with survivors in the sex trades is incredibly important. And asking ourselves, what do we do when the options on the table all suck and are all dangerous, and none of them are solving the bigger term problems or the longer term resources?
So yeah, considerations on safety plans and safety planning. Survivors are the experts in their own experiences. We've all been to that training. I think that it gets a little tricky though, again, when maybe we don't share an experience with someone, or that, you know, like if I'm an advocate and I don't have experience in the sex trades, I might not understand like how things work. So, you know, if someone is telling you like something bad that happened to them, but they're kind of like, yeah, whatever, it wasn't a big deal. Like, we don't need to fixate on that thing because it makes us uncomfortable, because the person is, you know, less bothered by, you know, this thing than we would be if it happened to us. And there's not always one abuser or assailant. Like Kat mentioned earlier, the sex trades have some of the highest rates of sexual assault and domestic violence. So, you know, that is something to hold. You know, this might be something that has happened to this person multiple times. It may have happened from different people. It may have happened from, you know, non-trade intimate partners, as well as paying clients. You know, and also thinking about how those might be different. How, you know, maybe being assaulted by an intimate partner that is not part of work is different, or could be more or less impactful than being assaulted by a client, for example. And a lack of support after a traumatic experience may destabilize the survivor, which might limit resources, and might put them back in a high risk situation. So, for example, just as an example, say like you do enter someone into services and you set up a time to meet with them and they don't show up. You know, we don't want to blow up their phone and annoy them, but we might check in and say, hey, you missed our appointment. Is something going on? I think that also, as advocates, we sometimes internalize the way that we interact with people. And at the end of the day, we are service providers and we are there to provide a service. And, you know, it's important that we don't get our feelings hurt when people aren't as consistent as we want them to be. You know, and if people are feeling that, they might disengage. So I think it's important to be consistent and to build trust. Again, sex work has one of the highest rates of workplace sexual assault. And at the same time, leaving isn't always the best option. So we can support people by, you know, throughout all these scenarios, you've demonstrated meeting people where they are and focusing on creating stability around their current situation, and moving from there. So maybe someone is doing sex work and doesn't want to leave the industry, but wants stable housing so that they can screen their clients, so that they can say no to things that feel risky without maybe living in a motel. Something that we experienced during COVID a lot was there was an eviction moratorium, which was helpful for some people, and it was not helpful at all for people who were living places where they weren't on a lease, and also did not help anyone who was living in a motel. because people living in motels do not have renters' rights. So, maybe, instead of, so maybe someone says, I don't want to get out of the industry. I just don't want to continue to live in a motel. I would like to live in a house. And that's their need. So, I think that those are some things that are unique to working with folks in the sex industry.
These are just a few check-ins for service providers when you, I think, or we are kind of like making offerings or like talking about other services or talking with folks who have identified or you've identified as being in the sex trades, and sort of like ways you can check in with yourself. Asking yourself, can I supply the needed resource if the person leaves? So let's say you're on the phone with someone and they're like, I need, I'm in a situation right now where I have been assaulted multiple times because by paying clients. I've been assaulted multiple times by paying clients, and like, I can't do this work anymore. Can I please get a motel voucher? As much as we want to be able to say like yes, and should say yes, of course, to the immediate voucher, we have to think beyond that. If this person is also sharing with us that they have, no other sources of income and no other avenues of work, then it might be our job to have a hard conversation once they're in a place where they have the capacity to do so around what happens when the motel voucher ends. Like, if we don't have the necessary resources to continue to house this person, then what does safety planning look like for them? And are they identifying, like, sometimes I think this can get really complicated when folks are, identifying needs that they're very much like, this is what I need right now, especially when it comes to housing. Like, I need housing. And also based on the options available and kind of based on where they're at, we are not able to, like, that isn't an immediate option. And being transparent will be really important, because as they give us more information in this situation, the more information we give this person in a hypothetical scenario about what the reality is of the options at the table, the more they can kind of look at that risk and resource, like that risk and resource equation, and decide, do they want a safety plan on continuing to do in-person work? Do they want support in safety planning and exploring working maybe in a lingerie shop where there's added security? Do they want support in staying in a shelter while they apply for maybe Social Security or unemployment? All of these different options on their table. We also want to be asking ourselves what generalizations I might be making about this person's experience, and how can I check those? Especially when we do presentations, we often, like, as I had said earlier, by nature of what a presentation is, make kind of generalizations about experiences. And when we're in those one-on-one moments, it's important to check ourselves and know that we hold these informations from the trainings that we do that are more open-ended, from skills that we've built as providers. But every individual situation is unique, and it is not our job to fill in the gaps or to make assumptions about what they're telling us. It can be really challenging when someone, as I had mentioned, might be describing a sexual assault to you, and based on your knowledge and experience working with survivors, you might be thinking that it's going to go in a direction where they want support around emotional support, around prosecution, around getting a SAVA. And at the end of the conversation, they might say, and I can't fucking believe this person didn't pay me. I am so stressed out about my car payment. It's important to kind of like check that generalization while you're listening to this story, and put yourself in a place where you are listening for their needs and what they're identifying. And it can be really challenging, especially working for individuals in the sex industry, because there can be a huge dissonance on a lot of the experiences someone might have on working with, not always, but sometimes with working with folks who experience sexual assault outside of the sex industry. and working with folks who experience sexual assault in the sex industry. There are different barriers, right? Like we've talked about, different barriers around law enforcement, different barriers around safety, different barriers around all these different things. And so holding those are important. And asking yourself, are you focused on the incident or the industry? And this comes up a lot. Like we had mentioned, you know, sex work has the highest rate of sexual assault of any profession that you might find yourself in. But that doesn't mean that leaving is always the best option. It can be challenging when someone is, describing experiencing, sexual assault multiple times while in the sex industry, and not sort of making a generalization or focusing on the industry as a whole as being bad or as being the cause. It's important to really have that survivor-led and survivor-centered perspective where we remember that, number one, the sex industry is not responsible for sexual assault. Violent perpetrators of sexual assault are the only people responsible for sexual assault. And that's why centering the survivor's experience and their needs is so important. And we have another practice scenario. Take it away, Saiya.
Kat, how would you feel about skipping these last two scenarios so that we have time for questions?
Yeah, we could totally do that. Do you want to just do the second one? I feel like the second one is important.
Okay, we only have about 15 minutes left, so we can do it quickly.
Yeah. Maybe we just read this one and then kind of give like the highlights afterwards, so we have 10 minutes for questions. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah.
Cool. So practice scenario, the last one. You've been working with a survivor for about a month. A couple weeks after they were entered into services, they admit themselves into a hospital for sexual assault. You go to visit them and ask who hurt them. Upon arriving, it is clear they have bruises on their throat and scratch marks on their face and shoulders. They tell you that they met a date online, who was an angel sent from God. They detail their experience with the angel. They say the assault occurred in an elevator, but later they describe it happening in a stairway. You ask if they want to make a report, but they decline. They also say God has been texting them and telling them that if they tell anyone what happened, they will go to hell. They then show you their cell phone with multiple missed calls and texts from an unknown number, and they says they're scared because God knows where they are. How would you safety plan with this person? And maybe I'll read these like little highlighted things, Saiya, and you can share kind of our safety planning brainstorming around the situation. Does that sound good?
Sure, yeah.
Cool. So some things when we were talking about the situation that we wanted to know is like, they admit themselves into the hospital for sexual assault. So they're identifying a sexual assault happening and they're a survivor. It's important to like believe and affirm that. We're also seeing that there clearly is like physical bruises on their scratch marks on their shoulders. So that something, again, something physical has taken place. They describe meeting a day online, which potential screening into other services, right? They obviously feel threatened. This person who is the perpetrator is threatening to them, and they are feeling threatened and scared as they identify that if anyone happened, they will go to hell. And you see on their phone that there are multiple missed calls and texts from an unknown number, and they're again identifying you that they're scared and someone knows where they are.
Yeah, so it's important to remember that something destabilizing, like an assault, can be very triggering and can escalate people into altered states. So sometimes, this will happen when something traumatic happens. There is, there might be like truth in what this person is telling you, even if they're describing things that you can't physically see.
Oh, and I think we had talked about like when you safety plan with this person, you might ask them like what makes them feel safe. You might ask them how God knows where they are. They might answer like, I told him I was coming here, in which case you're like, all right, I'm gonna network with the nurse and make sure that like they don't let anyone know that this person is here. Also reflecting their language, even to a point, even if it feels like a little bit, you know, if they're identifying that like the person who assaulted them was an angel, then instead of, and they're using that language, like you can mirror that language to an extent and say like, you know, validate their feelings without necessarily validating that like, you know, yes, this is the exact thing that happened. You might say like, that sounds really scary. Like, I'm so sorry that that person hurt you. What do you need? Cool. Now we have like about 10 to 12 minutes left for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we have plenty of time. We definitely, if you have any questions off the top of your head right now, please drop them in the chat. I'm not seeing. No one has. I have a hard time believing no one has any questions in a group of 6.
Yeah, we did it all.
Awesome. They said there's what organization? Cool. Here's some good ones. I can answer the first one. What organization are we from again? Saiya is it all right if I speak for you? Saiya is an independent contractor and trainer, and I